Hello, welcome to Outside the Studio. I am so honored here today to introduce you to Matt Zemon. We're gonna dive into a really fascinating topic today, and I've been looking forward to this subject for so long. And actually, I've had my father on the podcast before talking about specifically cannabinoids and cannabis in terms of usage of alternative forms of therapy and medicine. So I'll put a link to that in this podcast because I think it will relate and draw some nice intersection. But that aside, Matt Zemon, MSc, has been studying depression for a long time and actually experienced a guided psilocybin or magic mushroom journey, and it completely changed his worldview. And so he enrolled in a master's of science in psychology and neuroscience and mental health from King's College London, and graduated with honors. And so that college, and Matt, you can speak more to this if you want. It's a cutting edge psychedelic research college, correct?
They're doing some great research in the space.
Cool. Yeah. And so we're going to talk a lot today about many different topics in your latest book, Psychedelics for Everyone, subtitle, A Beginner's Guide to These Powerful Medicines for Anxiety, Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Expanding Consciousness. And so it's kind of like, for me, I always kind of like to start with the history because I think it's so interesting how, I guess I would say, and I'd like to hear what your research, because I'm sure it's more vast than my knowledge, is indigenous cultures used things like ayahuasca or cannabis medicinally and ceremoniously. And so, historically, these things were sacred, right? And then somewhere along the way, these things became criminalized. And now it seems like we're starting to see them come back medicinally. More research is being done, and I want to dive into the data on that, about all these things I just mentioned. Anxiety, depression, addiction, PTSD, consciousness, and so first of all, I want you to add anything you want to your bio, and then I'd love if we could start off with the history of this subject.
I think you did a great job on the bio. I'm totally good sticking with that. And it's and I love talking with someone who has 500 hours plus of yoga teaching training, and just the connection between psychedelics and yoga is pretty profound.
Yeah.
And especially when we think about psychedelics not as a cure or as a medicine specifically, but more as a catalyst for change, in a way to explore parts of yourself that might not have been as accessible without this technology, and then how some of the practices that you teach and you embody can be used to really integrate some of the things that become obvious with this psychedelic medicine. But happy to talk. I mean, these have been used for thousands of years all over the world. Mushrooms, as an example, magic mushrooms, psilocybin, are grown in every continent except Antarctica, and there's cave drawings going back, 6,000-7,000 years with mushrooms in them. And they were really the guardians of them, were spiritual leaders for a long time. Our culture, the high priests of our culture are kind of doctors. We are all trained very young to give our authority over to them, and it's just it's an interesting cultural phenomenon in which we live, where we look to the medical community for guidance. Sometimes it's great, and sometimes there's some challenges with that. But it's historically ceremonial use, and then that crossed over into how it could help you as a health, your whole overall health.
Yeah, interesting, right? I do know. Do you know much about the criminalization, the process of criminalizing these things? The history of psychedelics.
Yeah, I mean, it actually goes back to late 1800s, but let's for simplicity's sake focus on the Nixon administration's Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And what they were doing, which they admitted to doing, talked about doing publicly at a later date, was they were trying to disrupt the Black civil rights activists and the anti-war leftists. And by criminalizing and demonizing psychedelics and other drugs, they were able to infiltrate those two groups. As we know, that's led to this war on drugs for the last 50 years. And that's led to mass incarceration and yeah, tons and tons of death and violence and all sorts of things. And probably for any of us born 1971 or later, we've lived our whole life in a prohibition that no one told us about. Like we all grew up learning about the prohibition on alcohol, but nobody said, "Oh, and by the way, we get to actually live in one right now with psychedelic medicine." No, we were just fed propaganda. Just say no. If you take any of these drugs, it's going to fry your brain. You're going to get addicted. There's no medicinal use. And it's hard. It's hard to combat 50 years of messaging for an entire population. Luckily, we have over 300 academic institutions studying psychedelics, papers coming out all the time, and people finding their way to the medicine either through the medicalization process, through a decriminalization belief, or through religious beliefs. And all three paths are and I think it's an and. I think all three are welcome paths, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses in terms of society change.
Yeah. So, okay. So we've kind of got a very high level, broad understanding of where we came from, how we got here, and then where do you see us going? And maybe I'm jumping the gun here a little bit because there's so many in between topics I want to address, but I'm curious, how do you see this landscape shifting in terms of decriminalization, starting maybe to get prescriptions from a general practitioner or a functional medicine doctor, actually being able to integrate these medicines into our healthcare system? If you're watching this, or if you're listening, I'm using quotes here because I have my own opinions about our healthcare system. I'm sure you do too.
I do.
I'm just curious where you see us going with these medicines, I don't know, in the next 5 to 10 years. How accessible do you see it being?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have massive change about to occur. So let's just look at Colorado's ballot initiative in the last election. What did the voters vote on? They voted to create a medical industry within Colorado for adults 21 and over, maybe it's 18 and over, I can't remember right now, where they would be able to access some psychedelic medicinal therapies. Okay, that's great. They also voted at the same time to decriminalize, I believe, 5 different psychedelic medicines and make those the lowest priority for law enforcement. Okay, so now we have a decriminalization step and a medicalization step. And then there was a case of a rabbi, of a psychedelic rabbi who was arrested and was in the judicial process, and they ended up dropping the charges against him, which I think is kind of an indication of, oh, well, they're also acknowledging a little bit of freedom of religion at the same time. So all that happened, just the very last election. It's going to make a impact on that state within the next 2 years. They're going to create this framework, decriminalization, a little bit of religious freedom. Oregon, your neighbor state, did a similar thing, and they're now emerging from their 2 years of how do we set up this medical industry and figuring out the rules of what that's going to look like. I think there's 20 some cities across the country that have decriminalized. There are different legislations in there for different states. So we're seeing this happening. The cat is out of the bag. Our information flows too freely right now for our citizens not to understand that, oh, wait a minute, there's a drug that can do all sorts of good things when used responsibly. And yeah, we want access to that. So I have nothing but optimism for the future. I think the work, and the last time I'm saying this, is the work that the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, has done to re-legalize MDMA is incredible. And here they are. They've gone through their phase 3 clinical trials. They've raised, I don't know, $150 million. It's expensive to bring a drug to market in America. And their phase 3 clinical trials, they were focused on treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. So think about veterans, first responders, victims of sexual assault, things where traditional treatment hasn't worked. None of the existing talk therapies or medical options. After 3 sessions with MDMA, 67% no longer qualify as having PTSD. It's an incredible result. So the FDA has given that breakthrough therapy designation, and that should be re-legalized in America within 2 years. And then psilocybin also has that FDA breakthrough therapy designation. Another bill that was just proposed, a bipartisan bill to reschedule that. But psilocybin, maybe it's 3 years, 4 years, something like that behind. From now, it will be legalized across the country. It's just these are just too powerful and too safe relative to other drugs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so topics I want to touch on next. You're already starting to expound upon this. I want to dig a little bit deeper in terms of using psychedelics to treat these things like depression, like anxiety, like trauma, PTSD, things that are resistant to our typical therapies, like talk therapy, for example, and or our modern day usage of anti-anxiety medication.
Mm-hmm.
And what are those called? There's
antidepressants.
SRDs. Say it again.
Antidepressants, SSRIs, SNRIs, MAOIs. Yeah, there's a number of them.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we could get into the nuts and bolts of that a little bit, I guess, but I don't know if I want to, unless you think it's relevant. But my
thing relevant. I'm sorry, do you ask your specific question, then I'll come back with a relevant.
Yes, please. Thank you. MDMA, if we're not familiar with what that is and why it works and why that's kind of the one that's more readily available than other things like psilocybin so far. Can you tell us a little bit about MDMA?
Yeah, so MDMA, for a lot of us, grew up with knowing it as ecstasy. And what's super interesting is there was a study done where these scientists went and bought a ton of street drugs, and they tested the things that were sold as MDMA, and they tested it to see how much MDMA is in the MDMA that's sold. And something like 40 or 50% had zero MDMA in it. Only like 25% of what was bought as MDMA was pure MDMA. Wow. It's a terrifying number, but I think it's important for us all to think about, especially those of us who have kids or know people who are in that kind of a very vulnerable age range where they're experimenting and they're buying drugs in an illegal market because we don't have an open, safe drug market in this country. And drugs that should be safe, relatively, MDMA, psilocybin, they're buying things that are laced with fentanyl, and it's causing thousands of deaths. And it's just something, as we think about, well, drugs might not be right for you personally. That's a perfectly acceptable decision. But understanding the impact of having a prohibition in an underground drug market is also important to understand. So hopefully, as people hear these messages, they think maybe this isn't the right way to fight what fears I have about drugs. That's and then what's happening with MDMA. Well, actually, I mean, a lot of psychedelics as we compare them to antidepressants. So let's just for a moment talk about antidepressants. They don't work in upwards of 40% of the population. So if they work for you, fantastic. That's great. But roughly 40% of the population, they don't work. And then for a huge percent of people, the side effects are pretty significant. One study has over, I think 72% of people who are on an SSRI have sexual dysfunction. It's a huge number. The gastrointestinal issues. I mean, how many of us know people who are having pretty severe stomach things? They don't know what's going on. There's this, and there could be a correlation here. The weight gain, suicidal ideation in young kids. And it's an everyday medicine. It takes about 6 weeks to really get into your system, and then you're effectively addicted. So when you decide, oh, these aren't working for me, or it's time to get off, there's a whole process to get unaddicted to these antidepressants. So it's a high price tag medicine. And again, no bad anybody. And if they work for you, that's great. But it's interesting when you compare that to, let's say, ketamine. also legal in all 50 states, can be prescribed off label for depression, anxiety. The side effect profile is radically less. Um, and again, this is one where you can get addicted to ketamine, absolutely. So it's something that you pay attention to that. But under a doctor's care, the abuse potential is significantly less. You don't have the side effects, and we're seeing pretty tremendous results where people, after an initial like 6 doses within 4 to 6 weeks, might do it every month, every 2 months, every quarter, every year. It's not an everyday drug. So why ketamine isn't the first option versus the antidepressant, I don't quite understand that. And it'll be interesting to see again when psilocybin and MDMA come into the toolboxes, how they're used. And I think all of this goes back to, as a society, as a culture, we don't believe in feelings. It's like if you're feeling what we call clinically depressed, well, you're feeling a lot of sadness, or you're feeling a lot of anxiety. Uh, that's okay. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. It's then how do you, what is causing that? Is it an episodic? Did something happen? Did somebody die? Did you have a career change, a family change, a bad breakup? All of those things can cause sadness. Okay, great. And maybe you need some help to be as functioning and productive. Well, then let's call it that. We want to get you functioning and productive during this period, but we also don't want to just numb these feelings. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we agree that we've evolved over millions and millions of years, and we have tear ducts for a reason, and we know that happy tears are different than sad tears, we need to express this and not just numb the pain and go back to work. And that's where I think both psychedelics and yoga are super helpful. It's all about you are enough, and you are beautiful, and you are loved just as you are. And psychedelics can help you remember that. But then it's up to you to keep remembering that every day, and to finding the awareness of, oh, I'm telling myself a story, or I'm forgetting this. And yeah, I can adjust these patterns. Does that make sense, Tessa?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There's so many topics you're hitting here that in my mind, I'm having a hard time, I guess, parsing them out in terms of structuring this conversation in a way that feels really accessible to someone who hasn't had the experience of trying, whether it's recreational or medicinal or ceremonial, something like ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, or even cannabis. So I guess what I'm wondering is, can we talk a little bit more about, okay, you said something a little bit earlier that I wanted to touch on, and I think this will help steer the conversation. When used responsibly, we're talking about when used responsibly. So we're not necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong when you say this, we're not necessarily talking about these in the context of recreational use. Okay.
Yeah. So
yes.
Yes,
No?
and it's definitely yes. So
Okay.
I want to be careful with this though, because I don't want anyone who is using these medicines recreationally, these drugs recreationally, to feel like I'm judging them. Mm-hmm. No, you're
Absolutely.
taking your path. So that's okay.
Yeah.
But there is a higher level of risk associated with recreational use. There's a higher level of risk associated with not preparing for these, with not understanding how any drug may interact with anything else in your life, or our lives. There's a higher level of risk associated with not being prepared for what could happen on a journey. It's a higher level of risk for not having someone to talk to after the journey's over. So yeah, I no judgment for those using it recreationally, and for those who are saying, well, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. I'm curious about this. Mm-hmm. So what are you talking about with responsibly? These are the things we're talking about. Typically, we talk about 3 S's. So source, set, and setting. Source is, where did the drugs come from? Do you know that they're pure? If you're doing this in the medical system, so you've gotten ketamine from a licensed prescriber in your state, and then you've gone to a pharmacy or a compounding pharmacy, you know you're getting medical grade ketamine. Great. If you're in the underground market or an underground ceremony, have they tested their drugs? Do you feel good about there? So that's all about source. And then set is your mindset. Have they prepared you for what could happen on this journey, how long it's going to be, what types of things you could experience, what physical and mental things could happen? So just you're aware and you're going in not just with consent, but with enthusiastic consent. Okay, I understand the risks and I understand this process and I want to do this. Okay, great. And then setting is, are you in an environment, a physical environment where in this vulnerable, non-ordinary state of consciousness, you know you're safe. You know that you're not going to be interrupted. There's not going to be a distraction. You don't have any there won't be any inappropriate sexual energy brought in your direction. All these, I mean, you're vulnerable. You're in a different state. So making sure that that setting is that environment is another piece of this when used responsibly. So source, set, and setting are things that I would look at if I'm trying to get into this, whether you're doing it medically or ceremonially. Yeah, those are things I would absolutely look at.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I love that. That's a great way to remember how to try this responsibly. And in terms of finding a licensed provider in our states, do you have any recommendations for how people go about doing that? It still seems a little bit daunting to think about even talking to a general practitioner, I mean, who do you talk to and where do you find these providers?
So let's start with ketamine because it's legal.
Mhm.
So the first question to ask yourself is, do I want to go into a clinic and have that type of experience? Or do I want to do this at home? And if in either case, you're going to want to ask that provider, how do you do it? Is this just a biochemical reaction where I'm going to come in, you're going to stick an IV in my arm or give me a shot or give me a lozenge? I'm going to have an experience, I'm going to go away. Or is there a mental health component to this? You're going to prepare me, you're going to help me set intentions, you're going to do some integration work afterwards. Or is there a ceremonial component? And if there is a ceremonial, what are your beliefs about that? So asking those types of questions up front are super important, regardless of whether you've chosen in person or at home with the medical model. Not all doctors have the same beliefs on how ketamine should be administered. And I'm not saying my beliefs on how ketamine should be administered are correct. It's up to you as the individual, you to decide what's right for you. But if you search ketamine near and enter your city, you'll find providers. There are a few national ones on the telehealth side, like Mind Bloom and New Life. And you'll find providers, and then take the time to ask the questions. This is not it's not a commodity, and they should want to disclose these things and then feel it's right. Similarly, if you're going underground, typically people, you know somebody who knows somebody.
Mhm.
Okay, so somebody introduces you. Oh, I know somebody who is a great practitioner of fill in the blank in blank. Now, maybe that means you're going to fly to Peru or Costa Rica or Mexico or the Bahamas or the Netherlands, or maybe you know somebody who's running ceremonies in your area. Same questions. Where did you get your drugs? Do you have them tested? What's going to be the process? What do you do to prepare me? What do you do during? What do you do to integrate me? How many people are going to be there is a huge question. Um, let me just stay on this for just a moment.
Yeah,
In Costa Rica, for example, there's a very popular ayahuasca retreat center that typically has 80 to 100 people at a time taking ayahuasca. It's super popular. It's a big number.
yeah.
There's another group that does beautiful work in Costa Rica. That's 40 people, and they have their reasons for that number. Um, in my experience, 12 to 18, 12 to 20 is a very manageable number for a group psychedelic experience. But also knowing how many facilitators will you have for the amount of people and kind of doing that math. Is it a 1 to 3, a 1 to 5? Um, and then I'm going to stick on this just for one more moment. It's kind of for me, it was counterintuitive. I thought the psychedelics, I would want to do them by myself
Mm.
with like a facilitator. And what I've learned for me is that the group experiences are significantly better, that there's a group consciousness, that
Mm.
my healing is your healing, that your healing is my healing, that we can all hold each other during these hold each other energetically during these ceremonies, and then integrate together in really I think an exponentially healthy way. That's what I have found. Maybe you believe something different and should try something different. Again, no bad. I'm just sharing what my experience has been. But definitely asking how many people will do this. I know in the ketamine group world, so back to the medical model, there's a lot of practices that will do 8 people. That's lovely. 8 people doing ketamine at the same time and integrating and talking about their experiences. Sure, that's great. But knowing what you're walking into is important, and anybody you're working with should have full disclosure in all of this.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to dive into on this same subject. And one is, especially if you're going underground, dosage. And then two, well, they're kind of separate, I think. In my mind, they are. And then the second thing I want to touch on is why integration is so important. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I could tell you why I think it's so important, but you are the expert. So I'd like to hear from you why you think integration is important. To me, it's like one of those key things that if we're going to experiment with these things, especially underground, that we really make sure we're integrating afterwards. So in terms of dosage, though, I guess I'm thinking about, and I can relate this to personal experience. I've had, like many kids going to college, I did a lot of experimentation, and there were many times where I didn't know the source. My mindset was not really in a good place to start with. The setting was, it was like a college dorm room, and I ended up staying inside for a couple of these experiences or journeys. And then contrastly, there were a couple of experiences where I was close to the redwoods. I went to college in the redwoods, and I got to go on a journey, psilocybin particularly, in the redwood forest. And that was exponentially different. So setting really does matter to me in my experience, than sitting in a kind of a dingy college dorm room. In terms of like emotional experience, there was a lot of fear in the college dorm room, and there was a lot of wonder and laughter in the redwood forest. So I'm not sure which one you'd want to start with, dosage or, integration, but what are your thoughts on these?
I'm going to go with neither and stick with setting for a moment, because what you talked about is beautiful. I mean, so you're talking about psilocybin or magic mushrooms again, for those not trying to play along at home. This particular drug really does make you connected to the earth. You feel connected with nature. We can understand, or at least I could understand for kind of the first time, oh, I'm not this independent thing. We are all completely interconnected. And many people have this experience of, at some point in a magic mushroom journey, wanting to go out into nature and connect. And you can feel like, if you have your I know for me, if I have my socks off, I can see my veins in my feet going into the earth and becoming like roots. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I don't think you ever look at trees again the same once you do psilocybin in nature. But I think you also don't look at other humans the same again when you realize, okay, the visual I love is, I might be a wave, you might be a wave. At the end of the day, we're all still part of the ocean. And I think psilocybin drives that home in this really profound, beautiful way. That being said, for many of us, the ceremonial space isn't as spectacular as the redwood forest. It can be a yurt in somewhere. It can be a yoga studio. It can be all sorts of things, and that's okay too. I think the difference is you pay attention to your space. There's a beautiful altar, beautiful sitting areas and nesting areas. Just making sure it is a place that you feel comfortable. You're not worried about someone coming in from down the hall or having random noise that's going to take you out of this inner journey you're in. So again, I can't stress how important setting is. And having the ability to do both is amazing. I want to have some inner time inside and then be able to walk out into the nature for part of it. Amazing, lovely, beautiful.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yeah, of course.
In terms of setting, because it's been my experience, and I'm curious to know if you found anything in your research about this or heard other people speak to this experience. But for me specifically, The setting, yes, it absolutely matters. A thousand percent agree. But more importantly, I think for me is that I need to be able to move my body in a way that feels free. And so I felt like inside in a small dorm room, very restricted movement wise, which makes sense, right? You're in a small room versus going outside and going on a hike, getting fresh air. But that for me is true across the board, whether it's cannabis or psilocybin or anything else I've tried. If I'm able to move my body and emotions like fear come up, or I start to spiral in a negative headspace, I feel like I can more easily process. And I mean, yoga is another space that like you're moving your body and it feels really good. And you're able to process these things as they come up. For me, it feels so much more important to be able to move freely in my body. What are your
Just
thoughts
going
on
to say yes. I mean, yeah, it's of yes. And I mean, the ceremonies that I typically participate in start with everybody kind of in a nest, in like a on a yoga mat with a blanket and a pillow and an eye mask. And typically the ceremonial leaders say, keep the eye mask on for a few hours,
that?
journey within. Um, I love it when there are live musicians that are reading the energy of the room and creating kind of a soundtrack based on guiding people musically through their journeys based on, oh, this person's breathing heavy. This pod of people are clearly going through something. Let's help steer them a little bit, but energetically. And then it's beautiful when people feel, okay, I've had enough of that for a while, and now I want to move my body. And that can look like dance. It can look like walking. It can look like play. It can look like rolling in the grass. It can look like all sorts of things. Um, but then I mean, then typically just trying to encourage people, stay with this, stay with this. No mundane discussion. This is your journey. This is you're here for a reason. Keep exploring your intentions and playing with it. But yeah, letting your body move and feel. Absolutely. I don't think we lose that. We so much of our, I mean, again, not you as a yoga teacher, but so much of us regular people who live regular lives, we are not moving enough. We are sitting far too much. We are not remembering that to be in touch with our bodies on a daily basis. So that medicine can be powerful reminders of, oh wait, I'm meant to move. I'm meant to dance. I'm meant to stretch. I'm meant to smile. I'm meant to laugh. Um, all of that.
Well, can we touch on dosage a little bit?
Mhm.
Because I want to, well, first of all, I want to define microdosing. That's something you discuss in the book. And I feel like it's a relatively kind of newish term in our lexicon. And I want to make sure we understand what we mean when we say microdosing.
So microdosing is when you're taking what used to be called a sub-perceptual amount of a medicine or drug. Paul Stamets has recently recoined that as sub-intoxicating, which I think is a better description. So you want to take enough that you can still function on your day. You can work, you can drive, you can interact with people. You really don't feel the medicine much. And it's typically 1/10 to 1/20th of a dose. So if a large macro dose of psilocybin, as an example, is 5 grams, maybe 150 milligrams would be a microdose. Very small amount. People typically, you can microdose with a bunch of things. But when people typically talk about it in our culture, we're talking about microdosing with either psilocybin, magic mushrooms, or LSD. And the reasoning behind this is typically people say, well, it helps the days be blues be bluer, the grays be less gray. It helps me feel more connected, feels me feel more in touch, more creative. The research is kind of split. The older research is that maybe it's a placebo. Maybe. Some of the newer research is saying, wait, no, it actually is leaning towards it does enhance creativity and connectivity and problem solving. Um, yeah, so that's all microdosing. One other thing about Paul Stamets, since you're up in Washington, the he recommends if you're going to microdose. So let's talk about the protocols. If you're going to microdose, Paul Stamets' protocol is you do it 4 days in a row. So pick any 4 days of the week, you do it 4 days in a row, and then you take off 3 days. And after every 4 week cycle, take off for 2 weeks, let it flush your system, and then start again. 4 on, 3 off, every 4 weeks, rest for 2 weeks. He mixes his, he recommends you mix your magic mushrooms with lion's mane and niacin. And he believes those three compounds together have the best results. So that's the Stamets protocol. Dr. James Fadiman, who is kind of the grandfather of microdosing, has a slightly different one. He says you take it on day one, let it still in your system on day two, comes out on day three, repeat on day four. So it's a little bit harder to keep track of every 4 weeks. So you still take a 2 week break. And yeah, both protocols are widely used. It's really which one feels right to you. But those are kind of the two ones. If you go to my website, mattzemon.com, right on that homepage, there's a free guide to microdosing. And I have both of those protocols in there, as well as the lion's mane and the niacin information. Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's certainly becoming popular. And it feels like many people start this process with microdosing, and they're like, well, this is interesting. Well, what's macrodosing about? And then we get into the bigger dosages.
Yeah. Well, what are the microdoses about? Do you want to speak to that at all?
Happy to. I mean, so you were talking about dosage before.
Mhm.
And this also ties into when you talk with whoever you're going into, they should be talking with you about, well, why are you doing this? What is it that you're looking to achieve? What is your experience with these medicines? What is your weight? What is your height? What other drugs and supplements are you taking? What is your psychological history? Do you have any, has anyone diagnosed you with a quote mental quote unquote disorder? What about your immediate family? So getting all that information is important to find out if there are any contraindications between anything you're taking and any medicine you're considering taking. Um, and then depending on what you want to do, the facilitator or the medical person will prescribe what they believe is the right amount of dose for you. Now, for those of us who are curious and want to kind of have more information on our own, there's a wonderful resource out there. There's a guy named Dr. Ben Malcolm, the Spirit Pharmacist. I believe it's thespiritpharmacist.com. And I think for $300 or something, he'll do a consult, 1 hour consult with really anyone across the country. And you can have him look over your whatever you're taking, and talk with him confidentially about whatever you're thinking about doing. And he'll give you a report. Okay, you might want to change this or alter that, or everything's good, or this is something you should consider or be aware of with this type of medicine. So that would allow you as a consumer, for lack of a better word, to then decide, okay, with this, I have this independent doctor who wants nothing from me other than to give me information. And now I'm going to take that information, I'm going to go look at XYZ thing I'm thinking about doing. And I feel okay about taking an ayahuasca journey or a psilocybin journey, or an MDA journey, or whatever it is I'm going to do. So it's, again, under harm reduction, it's a nice step to be able to take if you can afford it. And then dosages range. There are people who want the full macro dose of psilocybin. I want to go deep. I want to have as deep of an experience as possible. 5, 6, 7 grams of mushrooms. There's others who are like, I want to go deep, but I don't want to go quite that deep. And maybe 3 or 4 is right for them. But between you and whoever you're working with, you'll come up with that right number. And each different drug has a different dosing protocol, but they are reasonably well established. We know if you're going to MDMA, it's going to be 80 to 100 if you're typically. There's different protocols for different things, but that the Spirit Pharmacist is a fantastic resource for those who want to go get their own information before talking with any practitioner.
Yeah, thank you. So another topic I want to make sure we address before we have to end our conversation, because this is flying by, are power dynamics. And we started to talk about this a little bit when you brought up being in a vulnerable state and wanting to make sure, like, this is about setting, right? And making sure you know your source. And if you're doing something in a group that's guided, understanding who's guiding it and what the intention is and what your intention is. And power dynamics it's an important topic across, I mean, everything that we do in life, I think, especially in the wellness industry. And I feel this all the time, and I think about it often, and I'm always trying to stay relevant and educated around it, especially as a yoga teacher. And so if it's okay, I'd just like to read a little bit from the book in terms of defining power dynamics. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the prevalence of sexual violence in psychedelic ceremonies. And, how do we navigate around that? How do we dispel the fear? How do we make sure we're protecting ourselves? And I think you did a good job of already, saying know your source and ask these questions. But I think it'd be helpful to define power dynamics a little bit more. So do you mind if I just read a couple of sentences?
Please, no, I'm curious which piece you're going to read.
Well, just on page 106, it's
Okay.
the very beginning of what are power dynamics. And they are the relationships between people in which one person has more power than the other. And so we might go, okay, duh, that's kind of obvious, but I don't know. Is it so obvious? Because I think so often we go into a situation like a yoga room, and there is a power dynamic inherent there where me as a teacher has more knowledge typically. It's not true all the time, but typically I have more knowledge than the student that's coming into my classroom. So right there is a power dynamic. So power is present in social, political, and economic contexts and confers to those who hold it more ability to make decisions, take action, or even avoid negative consequences. And here's the thing I think I try to be really careful of. Well, maybe I try to be more mindful of it. It is often said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so this is important, I think, as wellness practitioners, as teachers, as administrators of these ceremonies. We stay really humble and educated and mindful of our own ego, and our own sense of power. And these people coming to us with wanting healing and needing to be vulnerable in a situation for the healing to happen. Do we need to be vulnerable for the healing to happen? I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that. But yeah, would you expand upon this a little bit more?
I mean, this is prior to doing this work, I didn't really give much thought to this. But as we look at our lives, and we're trained at an early age to give up our agency to our parents, to our teachers, to our doctors, to our therapists. And at least in quote normal everyday living, we're sober as we make those choices or have those or just accept those choices. But we've all heard, I'm sure, stories of therapists who have behaved badly with their patients, or have crossed the line, doctors who have crossed the line. When we talk about now introducing a psychedelic medicine into our mix, so we're talking about taking us from a ordinary state of consciousness into a non-ordinary, where we're not thinking the way we normally think on purpose. It's a scheduled psychotic break. We've done it on purpose, but we have, in many cases, less control over our body. In many cases, we're feeling incredibly strong emotions. We're feeling lots of love. We're feeling lots of, a lot of different things. I don't think it's hard to understand how that could be a situation where a predatory person could take advantage of that. And they could take advantage of it both in the actual moment or following those moments because the participant feels like that teacher took them through something. And it's something to be aware of. So how do you, so first being aware is, there you go. That's part of the bottom, part of the battle. That whole chapter, by the way, was written by Leah Friedwoman, who is just a beautiful, beautiful soul and has thought quite a lot about this particular topic. Second thing you can do, so a lot of the studies on MDMA, as an example, would have two facilitators in the room at all time, typically a man and a woman. I think that's a great best practice. So asking your, again, above ground or underground practitioner, who's in the room, who's facilitating this ceremony? Is there a balance of power? In the therapist, there are ethical guidelines when it comes to mainstream therapy. A number of the practitioners out there have agreed to an ethical practice. So there will be no sexual contact, period, between the facilitators and the participants. Does whoever you're looking at working with have that type of ethical boundary? I don't know. That's worth asking about. So those are the types of things to look into. And then also, are the participants agreeing up front that they will abide by those rules during this? I know many of the retreats that I've participated in, you sign a release and waiver up front saying there will be no sexual contact during or following during the entire ceremony weekend, either on self or others. Okay, that's a big deal. Going so far as touch. I mean, it doesn't sound like a big deal well, I wanted to put my hand, they were struggling, and I put my hand on their shoulder, or I held their hand. If you didn't ask for permission in that state, you don't know what they're working through. So all of those things are important as we're thinking about this. So again, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about how does this work for me or someone I love, asking these questions up front, just being aware of it, and making sure you choose somebody who you think embodies safe practices is an important part of this process, and it takes us all the way back to, again, recreationally. No bad anybody, but these are things that are often not discussed in a recreational context. And sometimes when people have traumatic experiences in the space, it's because this was not, this in particular was not looked at. Someone had the medicine, someone gave the medicine, someone got into a non-ordinary state and made decisions that they might not ordinarily have made.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Gosh, I feel like I need a round two with you because I have so many more questions. So I'm trying to decide right now where I want to go for the next few minutes. Yes, and I would love a round two. That would be amazing. Okay, so what I'm wondering is, neurologically, in your research, do you know if is it more helpful to try psilocybin for some per symptom? Like, is ketamine more helpful for PTSD or anxiety, or just, let's say, for example, I want to be more focused. I want to write the next greatest novel. I want to tap my creativity. It doesn't always have to be that there's something wrong that we need to heal or fix, right? But are there specific drugs for specific circumstances or symptoms in your experience?
So there is research on specific drugs for specific symptoms. So you could look at Johns Hopkins has done some beautiful papers on psilocybin for smoking cessation. Mm-hmm. Okay. Or LSD for alcohol, or ketamine for alcohol. Ketamine for eating disorders. I mean, there are papers. I don't think the volume of papers is really, I don't think that's necessarily what should be the barometer. I think in the space, people talk about, people get called to different medicines. So I felt the call to ayahuasca. I felt the call to go try mushrooms. I felt the call to go try ketamine, or I wanted to stay with something legal, so I'm going to try ketamine. Great. Or I want to take a trip anyhow, and this place in Jamaica or the Netherlands offers psilocybin. Or great, let's do that. And I think people bring all sorts of different intentions into this. So I'm hesitant to say this particular medicine is better for one thing versus the other. There's exceptions to that. I think, though, if you're called to do it and your intentions are clear, the different medicines can give you the insights that then you can use as a catalyst to then take lifestyle change to work with whatever you're working on. A couple exceptions. Ibogaine, I'll bring up. If for opioid disorder specifically, I don't know if there's anything better than ibogaine. Certainly, if I had a family member who was struggling with an opioid addiction, we would be going and finding an ibogaine
That's
clinic.
Not one I've heard of. How do you spell that?
Ibogaine. It comes from the iboga root. Was traditionally used in Gabon and other areas in Africa in ritual ceremony. It is something to be very careful with. It is one of the psychedelics that does has risk of cardiac events. Mm. It is more intense physically than ayahuasca. It is significant, powerful medicine, but it has been shown to be very effective in opioid challenges. And then And then I guess I would divide the others into heart openers. So when people talk about MDMA or MDA, otherwise known as sassafras, those are really heart openers. So if you're looking to feel love for yourself and for others, looking for forgiveness, looking to remove shame, blame, and guilt and explore past traumas, yeah, that's powerful medicine for your heart. And that's why I think a lot of this PTSD research is being used with MDMA. Um, some of the others can be kind of head opening, third eye opening, or grounding. So psilocybin, LSD. I think even ayahuasca is going to be in that camp. And again, all beautiful, all can work for lots of different reasons. Um, and then I guess for people who are not familiar with the space, sometimes you do both. Sometimes on one day you'll do MDMA or MDA, and then the next day you'll do psilocybin. Others combine into the same ceremony. We're gonna do, and yeah, there's reasons to do all of the above, or to stack your medicines like you would stack any other type of medicine. But again, make sure you know who your facilitator is, what their experience is, what their logic is for whatever they're going to do, and just going with your eyes open.
Thank you. Okay, so I think the last question I want to ask is, and I've just read a little bit about your experience and how you got into this work. I believe you had suffered from a longstanding depression, which led you to a psilocybin experience, and then led you to educating yourself around the usage of these things medicinally. But I just like to hear from you, what's your history like with this? And I'm sorry, I'm leaving this to the last because I'm sure the history will take your history, your own personal experience will take more than a few minutes. But yeah, I think it's important to have the context.
Thank you for that question. So when I was 19, my father died. When I was 18, my grandmother, 19, my father, 22, my mother. My mom was 49. And then my great aunt was in there as well. So I had a lot of death in a very small period of time. And in this culture, this is the early 90s, there was I wasn't going to therapy. I was right back into school and then back into work. Um, and I just missed my mom. It's just sad. But I put in a drawer and went about my life, got married, had kids, built businesses, but never really healed from the sadness that all that death had that I experienced with all that death. Mm-hmm. In that very first mushroom experience, my mom was there. And I know for listeners who have not experienced this, it's hard to imagine, but she was right there. And I could feel her and pull her into me and push from me into my children. And it just occurred. It's like, okay, wait a minute. She's not gone. I don't have to think of her as gone. She's right here. But that was a very different perception or perspective on life after death for me. Again, we're talking about almost 30 years later. The realization that I've been living my life assuming I was going to die young, and the choices I had made was like, oh, what am I doing? That's not my story. I don't need to die young. That's different. I felt so safe and loved in that very first experience that I was like, oh, wow, feels amazing. But then the realization occurred to me of, oh my God, I don't feel safe and loved in everyday life. I didn't even know, I don't even remember feeling like this. And again, normal person, married, kids, businesses, not feeling safe and loved. And then that led to, okay, what do I need to do when I'm not taking drugs to feel safe and loved, to feel like enough, to feel love, that I have the ability to share love openly, that I don't need to be stingy with it. There's plenty for everybody. And I don't need to think about love just in a relationship sense, or in a sexual sense. It's free to be. All of that came in that very first experience, and then has only been reinforced over the years of different compounds, different studies. But when I talk about psychedelics aren't a cure, it's a catalyst for change. It's your mind going, oh, there is another way to think about blank, to process blank, to move forward with blank. And then what do you put into your daily life to remember that? Is I think that's the integration part. That's the piece that is so important, that otherwise you just took a ride. I just took a trip to Japan and now I'm back and now it's gone.
Yeah.
But if you can take that trip and then join a community, have people to talk to, the ability to change all sorts of patterns and behaviors is just incredible. Because you're starting from this position of you can't fail. You can only learn, heal, and grow. And healing is going to be inevitable. At some point, you're dying and going on to this other place. So if you can only learn, heal, and grow, you can't fail. How does that allow you to live this next part of your life? And I think it's super, super empowering for people. And that can be in how you got there. I was having depression or anxiety or grief or trauma or whatever. Substance use doesn't make a difference. It's where you go afterwards. And you can go anywhere you want to go afterwards. And that's the power of the medicine.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a good place to stop for now, but like I said, would love to talk to you again, maybe see where you are and what you found next year, what's evolved, what's changed. And Matt, I just can't thank you enough for your time and your wisdom and your loving presence. It really comes through. I can feel it just speaking to you and watching you talk.
You make it easy, Tessa. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Any final words, any key takeaway you want to make sure that gets put out there, drilled in?
The book is called Psychedelics for Everyone. And I just want to reiterate that I don't believe everyone should take a psychedelic, nor should everyone take a psychedelic. But I do believe that psychedelics are for everyone, and that the good for society to have these as legal for whatever reason, medicinal, recreational, religious, is important. And that's what I hope with this book, that I've outlined, these are how the medicines work. This is the research around it. This is the pros and cons, that people can make their own educated decision on whether it's right for them or someone they love, or just on how they're going to vote next year on whatever the topic is in their city, state, or national election.
Yeah. I do love the way that you've organized it in that way. It's very accessible. So it truly is a book that, in my opinion, I would agree, the title is apt and appropriate. Thank you so much.
Tessa, thank you. I really appreciate these questions today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everyone, that concludes another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something new, maybe remembered something old, maybe felt inspired to apply something to your life. You can hear my dog in the background. She's doing a little happy dance. So Daisy enjoyed it. Anyhow, I wanted to just pop in here to wrap us up to say a couple of things. Number one, I have such an amazing team that helps me put these podcasts together. Without them, I wouldn't, be able to bring these amazing conversations to you. So thank you to my producer, my director of creative services, my sound editor, my engineer, Consistency Media. Don't know what I would do without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the amazing creation and artistic musical genius, Drew Lovern. Thank you so much for putting together this music specifically for Outside the Studio. So unique to the show, only place you're ever going to hear it is right here. Thanks, you guys. You make my world go round. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, share on the socials, especially if it's a show that you think, hey, this could help somebody else. That's what this is all about, right? We're sharing information so that we're better
so that we're inspired, so that we're lifting each other up, and we're learning how to be in this world, living on this planet to the best of our ability, sharing information and inspiring one another. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the show. Take care.